Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I'm happy to welcome you to a presentation on Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. We extend a warm welcome to our fellow veterans who may be watching this program from the Edith Norse Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in Bedford, Massachusetts. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Joseph Joe Nye. Joe Nye is a world-renowned scholar, teacher, and presidential advisor on foreign policy. A member of the Harvard faculty since 1964, he has served 3 presidents, beginning in the Carter administration, focusing on nuclear weapons. In 1993, President Bill Clinton appointed him chair of the National Intelligence Council, which coordinates all 16 intelligence agencies. He was next appointed Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He returned to Harvard to become Dean of the Kennedy School. He was an informal advisor to the Obama administration. He has personally taught a Secretary General of the United Nations, a former president of Mexico, senior military leaders, members of the US Congress, and journalists for the New York Times. As President-elect Biden names his cabinet, Nye is confident that some of his students will be in this group. He and his wife, Molly, have lived in Lexington since 1965. And so it is my pleasure to say, please welcome our friend and neighbor, Joe Nye.
Thank you very much, Linda. It's a pleasure to be back with Lexington veterans. And I applaud all of you. And I'm looking forward to having a chance to chat, in a sense, about these topics as we get into the questions and answer period. And that can include many of the events of the recent week that we've just experienced. But let me first lay out some ideas about whether morals matter and what do we mean when we talk about a moral foreign policy. Does it make any sense at all to even use that language? There's some people who say no, that look, morals are not important in foreign policy. National interests are all that matter. And if it's since national interests bake the cake, and then politicians come along and they spread a little moral icing on it to make it look pretty, but it's all national interests. In fact, I once, when I was working in the State Department in the Carter administration on nuclear issues, I remember sitting down talking with a French diplomat after we'd been spending all afternoon negotiations. And I said to him something about, do you ever worry about what sort of the moral implications of these decisions we're making are? And he said, no. He said, there are no morals. There's just the interests of France. And I don't think he realized what a profound moral judgment he had just made when he made that statement. But it's not an atypical statement. That it's really just national interest that matters. But even national interest doesn't answer things, because moral questions come in when you define the national interest. Donald Trump used to talk about America first, but even America first, there's nothing wrong with that, in the sense that I'm sure Emmanuel Macron must say France first when he talks about the French national interest. The question is not just whether an elected leader defends the national interest, that's what he's elected to do, but it's how they define the national interest. Do they define it narrowly or broadly? And very often, Trump defined the national interest extremely narrowly. whereas other presidents like Harry Truman and others have defined it very broadly. If you think of something like the Marshall Plan. But let me give you a simple example that I've sometimes used to explain this to my students. Imagine that you were sitting on the beach reading a good book, and uh, uh, you were just about to finish a chapter, and you heard somebody cry out, "Help, help," in the surf. You, I think, would put the book down and try to help them if you could. But suppose you're the same thing, you're sitting there reading the book, and you're trying to finish the chapter, and somebody says, "Ayúdame, ayúdame." And you say, would you say to yourself, "Oh, that's a foreign language, I don't have to help"? Of course not. You'd probably put down the book and see if you could help. So in that sense, it's not as though when we ask what's our national interest, that we think in narrow terms. We can also think in broad terms. Now, it's also true that if you were in that same situation and you had you had two cries, "Help, help," and one of them was your child and another one was another child, you would probably help your own child first, because you have as being a parent, you have an additional moral obligation to protect your own child. So as we think about our sense of community and loyalties and moral obligations, they often come in sort of concentric circles. It's not either or. It's not like Trump's advisor Steve Bannon put it, that you're either a strong nationalist or a rootless cosmopolitan. In fact, we have lots of identities and lots of loyalties. And when we define the national interest, we have to combine them in different ways. So in that sense, I think the question that people say, "Oh, it's all national interest," sort of begs the question, which is, how are you going to find the national interest? In any case, when I wrote this book, Do Morals Matter, I really had two purposes. One was to ask that question by looking back historically at the 14 presidents we've had since 1945, and see if I could find examples where their moral views made a difference to history. Or was it, as sort of the cynics would say, just icing, it didn't matter? And then after having answered that question, I wanted to ask, how do you think about morals if they matter? But let me first answer that question of, do they matter historically? Well, I think you can find a number of examples, and I show these in the short vignettes of the 14 presidents in my book, where the moral views of the president made a big difference. And probably one of the most interesting cases is Harry Truman. Harry Truman has often been condemned by people who say that it was immoral for him to have dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And indeed, when Truman was offered an honorary degree at Oxford University, one of the philosophers there, a moral philosopher, refused to attend the ceremony because she couldn't abide by the idea that he had killed so many innocent people. On the other hand, at the time that Truman dropped the bomb, we didn't fully understand what the implications were, A, and B, the wartime restraints against bombing cities had pretty much eroded. World War II was pretty bad for just war theory, which said that you don't harm civilians. So in that sense, Truman, when he dropped the bomb, had a common view of what was moral or not. But what's interesting that people don't know or don't remember is that Truman, when he saw the devastation of what the bomb had done on Hiroshima, told the military no third bomb. And in fact, there was a third bomb waiting on Tinian Island to be dropped. And he said, no. He said, I'm not going to kill that many more women and children. And perhaps even more interesting is that 5 years later, when the United States was embroiled in the Korean War, and we had marched up the peninsula to the Yalu River, and the Chinese came in and pushed us down the peninsula again. General Douglas MacArthur said to Truman, I can win this war for you if you'll give me permission to drop 20 atomic bombs on Chinese cities. And Truman said no, even though he knew it was going to be something which would undercut his capability of running for a term renewal of his presidency in '52. And he did it because of moral considerations. And sometimes when people think back on the history of this, somebody like Tom Schelling, one-time Lexington resident who went on to win a Nobel Prize in economics, Schelling said one of the most important things that's happened since World War II was the development of what he called the nuclear taboo, that nuclear weapons were to be used for deterrence, but not for war fighting. And if you ask yourself, does this matter? Imagine what the world would look like today if Truman had said yes, and we use nuclear weapons as normal war-fighting weapons. I suspect the world would look very different. So Truman's view that he wasn't going to do this for moral reasons obviously had a big effect on history. There are lots of other examples in the vignettes I give of the 14 presidents about their moral decisions and how they mattered or not. But I think the important thing is that yes, morals do matter, and if you take the cynical view that if they don't matter, you're going to get history wrong. So that's one purpose of writing the book, because anybody can look at these short 10-page pictures of the president and make up their minds or not based on the evidence I present about whether morals mattered. But let's grant that that they did matter, and I think I give the evidence in the book to show that. Then how should we think about it? I mean, what's the right way to think about morals in foreign policy? And very often Americans take an easy way out, which is sort of, if we did it, it's moral. Well, it doesn't quite follow logically that if we did it, it's moral. There is American exceptionalism in which we consider ourselves a particularly moral people. Doesn't mean everything we do is moral. And for example, we took a good chunk of Mexico in a war which many people, including Abraham Lincoln, thought was immoral. So in that sense, just because we do it doesn't mean that it's moral. The other thing that people sometimes say, well, if we had good intentions, then it's moral. So for example, Ari Fleischer, who was George W. Bush's press secretary, said about the invasion of Iraq, Bush's invasion of Iraq was moral because he really intended well. He wanted to bring freedom and democracy to Iraq. Therefore, this was a moral action. Well, that's not good moral reasoning either. What I argue in the book is that when we're doing moral reasoning, there's a difference between that and moralism. Moralism is just posing as though you're doing good. Moral reasoning means you have to think in 3 dimensions. You have to think about your intentions. Are they indeed good? You have to think about the means you use. Are they moral means? And you have to think about the consequences and probable consequences and how well you assess those probable consequences. So a 3-dimensional moral judgment is, I think, good moral reasoning, and not simply having good intentions is inadequate moral reasoning. Again, let me just give you a little example from everyday life. Imagine that your daughter was going to take the SAT exams, and she was out at a high school dance, and a friend of yours said, oh, I'll go pick her up and I'll get her home early because I know you want to get a good night's sleep before the exams. So your friend picks her up at the dance, and he's a little late, and he's driving home kind of fast on a country road or winding road, and he it's been raining, the road's become slick. He is driving too fast. He skids off the road. He hits a tree, and your daughter is killed. And then he says to you, I had good intentions. Well, he may have had good intentions, but the means, driving too fast on a rainy road, were inappropriate, and the consequences were horrible, were highly immoral. And I think in some ways the invasion of Iraq was a little bit like that. Maybe Bush did have good intentions, but the means he chose were not appropriate, and the consequences were horrible. The means, trying to bring democracy in Iraq, it wasn't very hard to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Our military was very good at that and accomplished that quickly. But the idea that we can bring democracy to Iraq ran in the face of all the papers that had been prepared in the intelligence agencies and the State Department, saying this is not going to be an easy job. And similarly, on the consequences, if the purpose was to bring democracy and to get rid of the roots of terrorism, the effect of Bush's actions of the invasion of Iraq were to actually stimulate al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that eventually morphed into ISIS, the Islamic State, which had terrible consequences. So that's an example like my road accident, where it's not enough just to say, did you have good intentions, but did you have moral means, and did you have moral consequences? So what are the questions you have to ask yourself when you're doing this? I put a little checklist, a score sheet in my book, and it goes a little bit like this. Your intentions, the kinds of questions you want to ask are, did the leaders express attractive values? And did the leader have the emotional IQ to avoid contradicting those values because of personal needs? And also you have to ask about prudence. Did the president have the contextual intelligence to wisely balance the values that he pursued and the risks that he imposed on others? In terms of means, you have to ask two questions. One about the use of force. Did the president use it with attention to necessity, discrimination, and treatment of civilians in proportionality? These are basic just war theory ideas, which were embedded in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But the other set of means to think about are liberal concerns. Did the president try to respect and use institutions at home and abroad? And to what extent were the rights of others considered? And finally, when we come to consequences, the third dimension of my three dimensions, you have to ask, was the president a good trustee? Were the long-term interests of the United States advanced? But you also have to ask a question about cosmopolitan issues. Did the president also consider the interests of other peoples and minimize the unnecessary damage to them? And finally, there's an educational component of consequences. Did the president respect the truth and build credibility? And were facts respected? Did the president try to create and broaden moral discourse at home and abroad? That's what I mean when I talk about three-dimensional morality in terms of thinking about what is a moral foreign policy. Now, it doesn't mean it's always easy to come to these answers. You may find that not everything lines up just well, or you may be in extreme circumstances where there's almost no room for balancing these things out properly. I often use the example of Winston Churchill during World War II. After Hitler broke through the Ardennes and drove the British into the sea at Dunkirk, the question is what was going to happen to the French Navy. Hitler took over France, and the danger is that the French government was going to give the Navy to the Germans. Churchill basically did something which in normal circumstances would be highly immoral. He bombed his ally. He bombed the French fleet and killed something like 1,300 French sailors. And his argument was that I had no choice because it was a matter of survival. If Hitler had the French Navy to add to the German Navy, the Royal Navy could no longer protect Britain. And I, as a matter of survival, I had to do this act, which otherwise would be extremely immoral. So you can imagine what's sometimes called lifeboat ethics, or extreme circumstances where the range for choice is so small that you can't really see much room for moral reasoning. But the interesting thing is that most of foreign policy is not about that, the kind of narrow question of survival. Yes, we all want to protect national security, but more often than not, the issues involved aren't ones of complete survival. Take, for example, the issue of how Trump responded to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, who was the Saudi journalist who lived in the US, who was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and his body was dismembered by a Saudi intelligence group. Most people condemn this as atrocious action. And when Trump was asked about it, he said, well, not much we can do about it. It's bad. It's a hard world out there. We need to sell weapons, and we need to sell to the Saudis, and we need to buy their oil. And so we're not going to do anything about it, or not. Well, he's right that we weren't about to go and send these 82nd Airborne into Riyadh because of the Khashoggi murder. But on the other hand, you could have at least made a statement about that we thought this was a reprehensible action. Or you could have said, we're no longer going to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia for the use in this war in Yemen. Or you could have said, we're going to withdraw the ambassador for consultations. Even the conservative Wall Street Journal editorial page said that this was not adequate in terms of asserting American values to simply dismiss it the way it did. So what Trump was doing was treating the murder of Khashoggi as though it was like what Churchill faced in the French fleet situation in 1940, and it clearly wasn't. And that's why when you're trying to deal with issues of what's a moral foreign policy, you have to realize that there are going to be differences of degree. It's not going to be all one way or the other. You're going to have trade-offs. In fact, Henry Kissinger once said most of the hardest decisions that we face on these issues are in the range of somewhere between 51 and 49%. It's not always easy in there, but because it's not easy doesn't mean you don't do it. This effort to try to balance all three dimensions of moral reasoning, intentions, means, and consequences, is the right way to go about it, even if the answers aren't easy to come to. Now, when I tried to balance this in my own mind, looking back over the 14 presidents that we've had, in the ones that since 1945, the ones that I describe in my book, I come to the decision that there are really three major categories. There are four people that I put in the best. There are four people I put in the worst, and the rest are stretched out in various places in between these two. But for example, in the area of best, I ranked Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and George Bush as the first George Bush, Bush 41 as they call him, as the best. Interestingly enough, that's two Republicans and two Democrats, so it's not a partisan judgment one way or the other. On the worst, I ranked Lyndon Johnson for his foreign policy, not his whole presidency, but his foreign policy, particularly because of the mess he made in Vietnam. Richard Nixon, again, for the way he handled Vietnam, in which he allowed 20,000 Americans to die for the sake of what he called a decent interval. He didn't expect to win the war; he just wanted to have a decent interval before the North Vietnamese took over. I don't think sacrificing 20,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives justified that. Also, I rank Bush 43, George W. Bush, in that bottom category because of the invasion of Iraq and the mess that he made there. And then finally, I put our most recent president, President Trump, in that bottom category because he's really been the most amoral and immoral president we've had in terms of thinking about foreign policy. Trump not only lied, all presidents lied, but he debased the currency of truth. The Washington Post fact checkers in his third year in office said that Trump had lied something like 20,000 times. Now, Roosevelt told some big lies, and you find that Johnson and Nixon told lies. But when you tell that many lies, you totally destroy a sense of trust. And that debases the currency of trust. And it affects what I call America's soft power, our ability to get what we want through attraction rather than through coercion and payment. And Trump essentially, in the extent of his lying, took things beyond what any other president had done. Similarly, in the way he defined the national interest, he was very narrow in defining the national interest. He could have taken a broader view. Basically, if you go back to Harry Truman, Truman defined the national interest as the helping allies, and that we could do things that helped them and helped ourselves at the same time. So something like the Marshall Plan, where we helped the Europeans recover after World War II, that was good for us, but it was good for them too. And that perception that you can define the national interest in ways where what's good for us is good for others, that broad perception of the national interest is, I think, extremely important. In fact, it means that the role of international alliances and institutions is a very important part of what goes into a moral foreign policy. And it basically is George Shultz, who was Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan. Shultz had said basically foreign policy is not like real estate. It's not a one-time deal where I win, you lose, and how we bargain this out. Foreign policy is more like cultivating a garden. You're going to be there and you're going to work with these people and you're going to have to live with them over a long term. So finding ways where you can make mutual adjustments and putting this in the framework of broader alliances and institutions is an important part of what's a moral foreign policy. And this is an area, again, where I think that Trump fell down. So that's why I ranked him in the bottom group of the 14 presidents that we've had since 1945. The rest of the presidents are stretched out in various places in between. No president has a perfect record, including the ones I put in the top category and including the ones I put in the bottom category. No president has a purely imperfect record. But I do think that when we're making moral judgments about foreign policy, first of all, you have to realize that they do matters to history. And second, we have to think about it in a way in which we balance motives, means, and consequences, in which we do three-dimensional moral reasoning. And that's what's in the book. That's why I try to write it as a form of history which is readily available for anyone. I think you'll find there's no jargon, and it's pretty straightforward. And the histories of about 10 pages each for the 14 presidents allow the reader to make up his or her own mind. I'm not as convinced that my judgments are right on this in the scorecard business as I am that it's important for each of us to make our own judgments, but fully informed judgments, looking at all three dimensions of motives, means, and consequences. So my conclusion in the book and in this talk is that yes, historically, I can prove that morals do matter with the cases I give. And in terms of scorecards and making your own judgments, I haven't answered all the problems, but I've given you a framework or a score sheet, which can help you make up your own decisions. So let me stop there, Linda. That's what I have to say about do morals matter, ethics and foreign policy from FDR to Trump. And I'm happy and look forward to answering questions.
Excellent. All right, time for questions, folks. If you want to write a question, go to the Q&A box and type in your question. And if you would like to ask your question and to speak, go to the participant box and click on raise hand.
Linda, I have a question.
Okay,
This is
that's
Bob
Bob.
Lewis. This is Bob Lewis gone.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Nye. The question is a statement in your book. I appreciate if you would talk to it just a moment. A former Bush 43 official argued that Trump's greatest success was smashing the responsible stakeholder, and responsible stakeholders in quotes, consensus that has dominated America's China policy for decades and replacing it with a new paradigm of strategic competition, an extraordinarily important conceptual shift in U.S. strategic thought that will almost certainly have profound political, economic, and security ramifications for both the United States and the world. So could you just tell me what the responsible stakeholder consensus was that's dominated America's China policy and replacing it with this new paradigm of strategic competition, and why that's so extraordinarily important conceptual shift?
Well, the term responsible stakeholder was launched by Robert Zellick, who was a former student of mine, who was the Deputy Secretary of State in the Bush 43 administration. And what Zellick was trying to do was to get the Chinese to take part in developing an international framework like the World Trade Organization and so forth in a responsible way that could benefit not just them, but others as well. And I think that was very much the dominant theme of American policy toward China. It antedated Bush 43. Clinton starts this, and it goes on through Bush, and it goes on through Obama. And many people felt that China took advantage of this, that they didn't live up to being a responsible stakeholder, and that they were on international trading issues, for example, giving subsidies to state-owned enterprises and having coercive terms for intellectual property transfer, and that Trump sort of said, enough of that. We're going to put tariffs on you, and we're going to push you hard until you stop these practices. I think there's something in that. I mean, I think that Trump does get. I mean, if we were doing a balance sheet of things that Trump did well and Trump did badly, I put this on the positive side of his balance sheet. You can still complain about the means he used. Trump, instead of working with our allies and getting a common position on tariffs against China, he put tariffs against our own allies at the same time. So you could say that it was clumsily done. But I would accept the point that one of the positive aspects of Trump's foreign policy was to lay down a line with China about their behavior, that they hadn't lived up to being responsible stakeholders.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Judy Alexander. What roles did the president's religion, if any, play in moral decision-making?
Well, it's a good question. It varied from president to president. If you take somebody like Jimmy Carter, who was a very devout Baptist, and he was so devout that people don't always realize this. He used to teach Sunday school even when he was president. In other words, he took his religion very seriously, and Jimmy Carter placed a great deal of emphasis on human rights. In a sense, he elevated the status of human rights as an aspect of U.S. foreign policy. And a lot of that had to do with, was driven by his religion as a born-again Christian. Now, George W. Bush, Bush 43, also was a born-again Christian and took his religion very seriously. Notice both of them, both Carter and Bush 43, lived very virtuous private lives in the sense of compared to some other presidents like Kennedy or Johnson or Trump. But they were both very moral, and their moralism affected their moral views, their religious views affected their foreign policy. But for Bush, it was if I invade Iraq and I bring freedom to the Middle East and democracy to the Middle East, that is my mission. But what he didn't do was think carefully enough about whether he had the capacity to do it. And if he didn't have the capacity to do it, which he didn't, what were the consequences, the unintended consequences? So his religion effectively was a very important part of his foreign policy, what he saw as a moral foreign policy. But it had fairly negative effects in the sense he hadn't thought through these other dimensions of the means and consequences adequately. So if going back through all the presidents, I wouldn't have time to do all 14, but I've given you 2 cases of presidents who took their religion very seriously, and it did affect their foreign policy, and one of them was more successful than the other.
Okay. Fred Kobrick has his hand up and he would like to speak. He's going to ask his own question. So Fred, we are going to unmute you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, I love your books, Professor. I teach China foreign policy as an avocation at Brandeis, and one of the issues that comes up is that in the Spratly Islands dispute and in the Philippines fishing disputes and others, China makes up their own rules. They make up a line called the 9-dash line. They lose in the World Court on the Philippine fishing rights, and they say, we're not going to listen to those rules and those courts. And so they play by a different set of rules. And everybody knows that if you don't have tight rules in the National Football League, all you've got is a war and injuries. And so it's very difficult. China counters with a few things, like saying, well, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia abuses human rights, and because America has interest in Saudi Arabia, we look the other way, and they only look at us in that way. So they have this rule book that gives us a lot of trouble from a moral standpoint and from a physical standpoint in the Spratly Islands. How do we apply the Joseph Nye principles to a dynamic situation where one side wants to make their own rules?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I agree with your description of Chinese behavior. If you take something like their 9-dash line and the fact that they rejected the ruling of the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, that you can't just pour sand on rocks, reefs, and atolls and then call them islands which have rights to territorial sea, we have to respond to that in the same sort of zero-sum way in which they're doing it. In other words, they're going to break the rules. We're going to push them back. And that's why we have freedom of navigation operations. We send naval ships within 12 miles of these artificial islands to prove that the Chinese can't get away with that. So there are places where you have to have tit for tat. But there are other aspects of international politics. You can imagine a positive sum game. For example, when it comes to climate change, there's no way that we can solve the dangers and challenges that climate change is posing to us without working with the Chinese. And there's no way the Chinese can solve the problems that climate change is imposed to them without working with us and with the rest of the international community. So what I would argue is that when you reach into situations where they're breaking the rules, you've got to respond as we do with the South China Sea, with freedom of navigation operations, pushing back. But when you have an area like international climate, which basically is a win-win situation, we have to think in terms of power with other countries as well as power over other countries. So the problem that we're going to have as a country is, how do you manage an overall relationship in which parts of the relationship are strictly competitive and rivalrous, and other parts of the relationship require cooperation? I've called this the US-China relationship a cooperative rivalry. And we've got to be able to think of both halves of that equation at the same time. So rather than take the view, oh, it's a new Cold War with China and you can't do anything with them, you're going to say some things you can't do with them, other things you've got to do with them. And it's very hard for Americans to wrap their minds around the fact that in terms of a moral framework of good consequences for foreign policy, it's going to involve making choices of means where you compete and cooperate at times simultaneously.
Thank you.
Joe, Ed Bicknell wants to return to the invasion of Iraq, and he asks, wasn't the invasion of Iraq influenced by concerns about weapons of mass destruction?
No, absolutely. Very rarely is a foreign policy decision simple. I mean, that there's only one set of motives. If you look at the people who were influencing Bush, somebody like Dick Cheney, the vice president, or Don Rumsfeld, I think were driven by this question of weapons of mass destruction. They were a little bit careless about the evidence on weapons of mass destruction. Turns out that there weren't those weapons there. And they could have taken a more cautious route to ascertain that. But yes, for Cheney or Rumsfeld, who were as Secretary of Defense and Vice President in very influential positions, it was primarily that. For somebody like Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who was a neoconservative who wanted to press for freedom and democracy, it was much more the ideological dimension. Bush himself was both. He wanted to make sure that he handled the security situation, but he also had these illusions about the ability to bring about democracy in Iraq and in the Middle East. There were a significant group of people in the administration. Ken Edelman, who was a former head of the Arms Control Disarmament Agency, said at one point, it's going to be a cakewalk. In other words, when we go in there, they're going to welcome us with open arms. And so it's going to be cakewalks, there aren't any problems. This type of wishful thinking, particularly on the ability to get democracy and freedom into Iraq, had very negative consequences, that I described earlier. But you're right, it almost never is a foreign policy decisions solely of one set of motives. It's usually a mixture of motives. And Bush himself was torn. He had both the sets of motives. But if he'd been a little bit more prudent and cautious in his choice of means, he wouldn't have had such immoral consequences.
Franz Janssen would like to ask, do you think that the president's morals have an influence on the American population?
Yes, I do. I think basically the president has what Teddy Roosevelt called the best bully pulpit in the country. Bully, in Roosevelt's term of bully pulpit, doesn't mean bully the way we think of it today. It means bully as in good, which was a Teddy Roosevelt type of term. And the president is the person who commands more attention than anybody else in the political system. And so what the president does has an effect, and if you like, an educational effect on morals more generally. This is why I included an educational dimension to consequences. And that's also why I'm so critical of President Trump, because the example of continual lying has a very bad educational effect. If we look at the events of last week, if you have a president who's been lying to you for the whole time since the election, saying that this was fraud and that he won the election, despite the fact that in 60 courts of law, including the Supreme Court with judges that he appointed, there's been no willingness to find or ability to find fraud. That still has left, what is it, probably 40 million Americans who believe him. And some of those 40 million Americans were willing to desecrate the national capital out of that belief. So yes, the educational effect that a president has is extremely important, and it has a big moral impact.
Here is an anonymous question about President Eisenhower. Could you consider that Eisenhower morally blundered when he did not intervene in Hungary in 1956, yet at the same time consider it a prudent moral non-action?
Yes, I do. I mean, Eisenhower, when he ran for president, and John Foster Dulles was his foreign policy advisor and later became his Secretary of State, they talked about rolling back communism in Eastern Europe. That was never really very practicable in the sense that the Soviets were not going to allow communism to be rolled back. And so essentially in 1956, when the Hungarians revolted, which was, in my mind, a good revolt against totalitarian rule, Eisenhower was faced with a hard dilemma. Do you live up to the words that you've been preaching at the risk of creating a nuclear war? And he decided that the immorality of blundering into a nuclear war, or World War III, which could eventually go nuclear, was greater than sacrificing the freedom of these brave Hungarian rebels who stood up against Soviet rule. And so it's a little bit like the Churchill example I gave. Not a nice outcome, but considering the alternatives, one which I think Eisenhower felt was morally the right decision in terms of consequences.
I'd like to ask a question. When we were chatting with Joe before the session started, I was very impressed with all of the major world leaders and thought leaders Joe has taught in class. And we'd asked how many of the president's cabinet nominees Joe knew personally or taught, and he started rattling off names. And I thought maybe you could just mention a few people you know or have been involved with, or people you think are about to be nominated who have been either your students or your close colleagues.
Well, the ones I've worked closely with, Tony Blinken, who is the designated Secretary of State, is a very thoughtful young man who he actually went to high school in France, so he speaks French. Came back and he worked in Washington. He worked with Biden for years, so he knows Biden very well. He then became Deputy Secretary of State, so he knows the State Department. He knows how it runs. And that combination of knowing the State Department, knowing the world, and knowing the president is a good recipe for success as a Secretary of State. Similarly, Jake Sullivan, who is going to be the new National Security Advisor, who's only in his 40s, as McGeorge Bundy was when Bundy took that job for Kennedy. Jake Sullivan was a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford, so he's been and worked, educated overseas, knows the world in that sense. And then he worked both as a security advisor to Biden and to Obama. And he's extremely well-versed in foreign policy. And fortunately, he and Tony Blinken are friends, because one of the problems that sometimes happened in the past is when the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State don't get along and you get a conflict at the top, this can be problematic. Fortunately, these men both are smart and both get along, and both are work closely and well with Biden. Bill Burns, who has just been nominated to be the new director of the CIA, somebody also that I've worked with. He was ambassador in Moscow. He was Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East. He also rose to be the Deputy Secretary of State, so he knows that well. And during that period, he too worked well with Biden. And he's a very balanced and thoughtful man, very low key. He's worked for both Republicans and Democrats as a career Foreign Service officer, so he's not particularly partisan. And he's going to be a very successful CIA director. And his boss will be Avril Haines, who's a very smart lawyer. She's got good experience of having worked as Deputy National Security Advisor in the White House under Obama, and knows the intelligence community very well. So I think we're going to have on the national security foreign policy team a very able group of people, moderates, centrist, and able to think, and not just of good intentions, but what are appropriate means and how do we make good assessments of probable consequences. And I think I'm encouraged by these appointments.
Following on that, here's a question from Vern Ludwig about President Biden's future choices. Are you open to speculating about the prospects for Joe Biden to show moral leadership in his choices on as yet undefined challenges?
Well, I think Biden has suggested areas where he will rise to a moral leadership position. Take this issue of climate change, which basically Trump denied that it was serious and pulled the Americans out of the International Climate Accord in Paris. Every scientist I know says that there's a consensus among scientists that climate change is real and that the consequences can be very severe for us if we don't do something about it. And it's not going to be easy. It's going to require some hard decisions. I think what Biden has suggested so far is that he's going to face up to that and to put climate change at a higher position than has been the case certainly for the Trump administration. Another example would be the World Health Organization. China behaved badly in preventing the World Health Organization from getting the information it needed in the early stages of the coronavirus pandemic. And Trump then criticized the World Health Organization and pulled the US out. That was not the right reply. The right reply was to talk with other countries to try to strengthen and reform the World Health Organization. Biden has indicated again that that's something he's going to do. So on some of these issues, which are the ones that I earlier said can be positive sum games, where if we work with others, it's win-win rather than I win, you lose. I think Biden has already indicated that he's going to make the right decisions on this.
Okay. Mike Alexander was intrigued by your analysis of President Eisenhower's dilemma with the Hungarian revolt. And he wants to ask a follow-up question. With regard to your answer about the Soviet invasion of Hungary, isn't it true that the US didn't have the means to repel the invasion, given the proximity of Hungary to Russia and the comparative paucity of American forces in Europe? What realistic options did Eisenhower have?
Well, that's exactly the point, is we didn't have the means. And therefore, since we didn't have conventional forces that were equal to the Soviets that could push them out of Hungary, we were going to have to turn to nuclear weapons. And Eisenhower said, nope, that's not worth it. I mean, we're crossing a line where the consequences will be too immoral. So I think that's exactly the point. The real long-term moral of the story is they shouldn't have promised rolling back communism in Eastern Europe when they didn't have the means. And they shouldn't have raised the hopes with those promises when they didn't have the capacity to do it.
Pat Costello, are you prepared to give us some fresh information about calendars for the Veterans VA Medical Center?
Yes, I just spoke with my contact there, and they are still accepting calendars. So within the next week or so, I don't want to drag this out too long, but within the next week or so, you can either drop them at my house, which is at 9 Preston Road. Just to let people know, these calendars are generally used for the veterans to keep track of their appointments. So you're really doing them a big favor. It's not because of the pretty pictures. It is because of the calendars. And thank you very much for thinking of them. Okay.
The veterans really, really enjoy those calendars. So anybody, I get tons of calendars in the mail from countless charities, and I'm sure you do. And Pat is just ever so willing to collect them and take them over to Bedford. So pay attention to the chat line and bring those calendars over. In the meantime, Bob Lewis, do I understand that you have another question to ask?
I have two more, but I don't know how much time we have. But this one's a history question. You mentioned Operation Mongoose as being a precursor to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Could you explain that, why that was a precursor? I understand what Operation Mongoose is, but I never heard of it before I read your book. But so that the audience will need a little bit of background on the Operation Mongoose.
Well, after the United States under first Eisenhower and then Kennedy, supposedly covert invasion of Cuba in the Bay of Pigs, and that failed. Kennedy was stuck with the fact that he had a failure in Cuba. He hadn't been able to remove Castro. And so he had the CIA mount an operation of sabotage inside Cuba, hoping that that would bring down Castro. Of course, it didn't have that effect at all, but it did convince the Soviets, as well as Castro, that the Americans were out to get him. And this was one of the reasons why the Soviets said, if I put missiles in Cuba. It'll deter the Americans from another invasion or doing too much. And Mongoose was, from their point of view, an example that the Americans were preparing to invade again. So in that sense, that's the way in which it was a precursor to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Now, the second question, I'd like to read just a paragraph from your book. It says, moral choices are an inescapable aspect of foreign policy, even though cynics pretend otherwise. Humans do not live by the sword alone. Words are also powerful. Swords are swifter, but words can change the minds that wield the swords. As Henry Kissinger has argued, international order depends not only upon the balance of hard power, but also on perceptions of legitimacy. And legitimacy, of course, depends on values. Could you talk about, is this legitimacy of allies or foreign nations, or what is the perception of legitimacy, and who has the perception of legitimacy, and what is legitimacy?
Well, legitimacy is the feeling that actions are proper or in accord with a larger moral purpose. And legitimacy internationally is obviously strongly affected by where you stand. I mean, your different countries have different perceptions of legitimacy. Iran today has a different perception of legitimacy, let's say, than we do. Or so the question is, for most countries, do they see our policies as legitimate? In other words, if you're take something like whether you use force against another country. If you use force with a resolution from the UN Security Council, then it's probably going to be broadly accepted as legitimate. If you use force unilaterally without thinking about how other countries approve or don't approve, it's likely to be seen as illegitimate. And that's a contrast between Bush 41, when he mobilized troops to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. He got a resolution from the UN Security Council. Bush 43 did not. So essentially, Bush 41 not only had superb American forces, but he also had the soft power of legitimacy of most countries seeing what he was doing was right. Bush 43 had superb American forces, but he didn't have the sense of legitimacy for many countries, including a number of American allies, for what he was doing. So that's an example of how legitimacy is somewhat relative, but still can play an important role.
So we have heard from Bill Poole. And his question was kind of vague. I've asked him for clarification. He would like you to comment on North Korea. Fairly vague. I am assuming he means perhaps the current situation with North Korea. I'm not sure. He's free to speak up and clarify.
The situation on North Korea is very serious in the sense that Kim Jong-un, the current dictator, who's the son of two other communist dictators, his father and grandfather, is in possession of nuclear weapons, which he did by violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and is an unpredictable man. On the other hand, he's not suicidal, and he doesn't want his country to be destroyed. So you can deter North Korea. And then the question is, if we can deter the Soviet Union for 30 or 40 years, we can deter North Korea. But the question is, how do you reduce the danger that he provides by his examples and his posture? And that's where the real problem lies. What kind of diplomacy can you have to try to contain and surround North Korea? One of the first and most important components of that is to maintain our alliances with South Korea and with Japan. And if we do that, then I think we can contain the North Korean threat.
In the meantime, Fred Kobrick has another question. Fred, go ahead.
Thank you. If, as some people suggest, Professor, cyber warfare is now the new form of warfare for many practical purposes, is this going to mean that because we're the most sophisticated and we live in the most glass house, that we are the most vulnerable to the new form of warfare and we're not going to be able to use soft power anymore? How are we to protect ourselves against Russia?
Well, it's a very important question, and we've seen with this recent episode of Russian hacking into the company SolarWinds, which was providing services not just to many government departments, but even to Microsoft, that the Russians have a capability of really causing us great damage. What we're going to, and unfortunately, under President Trump, we didn't take this seriously enough. Trump was always worried. A friend of mine who worked in the White House said, Trump was always worried that if you picked up the Russian question, particularly in relation to cyber, it would reinforce the questions about his own legitimacy as a president in the 2016 election that the Russians interfered in. So we never responded properly to the Russians during the Trump administration. And one of the first things that Biden's going to have to do is to send an emissary to Putin and tell him, knock it off. We can do certain things to you, which we haven't done, but if you keep doing this, we're going to have to respond in tit for tat.
Well, if they have the ability, if they have planted these landmines in our system that we don't know about and won't know about for a while, are we in a position to use either hard or soft power or threats before we know what they could actually do to us?
Right. Well, that's why I suggest that one of the things that Biden ought to do is go to the Russians, send a top-level emissary, go to Putin and say, look, we either agree with certain rules of the road in which you scale back these things, you tell us some of what you've done, and you agree that you're not going to do certain things again, or we're going to do something very similar to you, or worse. So I think it's going to take a tough response.
It's very tough to see us doing that when in reality, we haven't gotten to agree on rules of the road with China. And I look at the Soviet question because of Putin's mindset as many degrees more complicated than China, because Xi Jinping actually is a very reasonable person compared to Putin. And I think that we could deal with Xi Jinping a lot better. Putin, to me, is not a guy that wants to talk rules of the road, is he?
Well, I agree. And if you go back to the Cold War, in 1972, when we and the Soviets were at loggerheads ideologically, we had a practice where we would buzz their ships and planes and come as close as we could to get them to turn on their radars, to get intelligence and so forth. And it became very dangerous. Sooner or later, there was going to be a collision and one thing would lead to another. So we reached an agreement with the Soviets in 72 called the Incidents at Sea Agreement, in which we said, when you do these sorts of things, you don't come closer than this close. And what's more, when you disagree with each other as to whether you violated that rule of how close you came, we're going to have a channel of communication where we can discuss it. That's what we're going to have to need in cyber.
I think we have emptied the chat box, the Q&A box, and the everything. So let us call that quits and just say to Joe Nye that we are honored and thrilled that you took the time to be with us today. And thank you so much for enlightening us and just giving us this friendly and hands-on talk. And several of us have read your book and enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you so much. And we just hope you'll come back and see us again.
Well, thank you, Linda, and all the best to Lexington veterans.
All right, thank you, Joe. And folks, thank you so much for attending. This concludes our afternoon presentation. Have a good month. Happy New Year. Happy inauguration. And we will see you next month. Thank you and good afternoon.
Bye.